The wind howled across the frozen fjords, slicing through layers of fur and wool. But inside the Viking longhouse, no frost had ever dared to touch the floorboards. Outside, the Arctic night pressed down with its unrelenting darkness, the aurora borealis shimmering like ethereal fire above the snow-draped pine forests. Ships lay moored, ice clinging to their hulls, and the sea itself seemed frozen in silent menace. But the families within these homes slept, cooked, and lived in warmth so steady it seemed impossible. How did they do it? How could people thrive in conditions that today would require heaters, insulation, and modern engineering? The answer was not magic, though to a modern eye it often looked like it. It was architecture born from necessity, knowledge passed down through centuries, intimate understanding of fire, wind, wood, and human endurance. Viking homes were not just shelters, they were living ecosystems, carefully balanced between heat, airflow, and insulation, a combination of science and instinct honed in one of the most merciless climates on Earth. Timber from slow-grown pines, cut in the depths of winter when resin was low, was chosen for strength. Earth and stone walls were carefully stacked to trap heat while preventing moisture from seeping in. The roof, steeply pitched and thatched with layers of turf, acted as a natural insulator, heavier than it looked, but breathable, letting smoke escape from the hearth while keeping the biting wind at bay. Inside, the hearth sat at the center, a modest fire fueled by dried birch and peat, but it radiated warmth to every corner. Smoke did not choke the inhabitants, it mingled with the thatched ceiling, slowly moving upward, creating a secondary layer of insulation. The Vikings understood thermal stratification without ever naming it. Cold air sank, warm air rose. Beds were elevated, placed strategically near the hearth, often layered with animal skins and reindeer fur. Children slept closer to the fire, while elders, wrapped in thick woolen blankets, rested at the peripheries. Floors were covered with rushes, straw, and hides, a barrier against the frost creeping up from the ground. Even doors were simple yet ingenious, double planks, sometimes with a small vestibule, acting as a buffer against Arctic gusts. But the secret went beyond architecture. It was ritual and routine. Food preparation, animal husbandry, and daily chores were orchestrated around maintaining heat. Fires were never extinguished completely. Embers smoldered overnight. Kitchens doubled as thermal hubs. Domestic animals, chickens, pigs, goats, lived partially inside in winter, their body heat contributing to the internal climate. Vikings tracked wind direction, precipitation, and snowpack intuitively, adjusting turf roofs, sealing gaps with moss, even moving furniture to block drafts. Every choice was a calculated act against freezing. Their clothing reflected similar mastery. Layer upon layer of wool, linen, and fur was sewn not just for warmth, but for airflow. Outer cloaks had long cuts that allowed movement while trapping pockets of warm air. Mittens were layered. Footwear contained moss for insulation. Even hairstyles were functional. Braids and wraps kept hair close to the body, preventing heat loss. Humans themselves became part of the thermal system. The hearth, the animals, the bedding, and the wood all orchestrated together. What is shocking to modern readers is that this knowledge was empirical. No textbooks existed. No universities trained Viking children in thermodynamics. The knowledge survived because it worked. It was tested in decades of bitter winters, measured by survival, by the quiet hum of domestic life continuing while the Arctic froze everything beyond the walls. Trade, too, played a role. Timber, turf, furs, and resins were not just commodities, they were survival tools. A miscalculation in supply could mean hypothermia or famine. Vikings were meticulous planners, storing reserves of dried fish, salted meat, and grains, not only for consumption, but as fuel. The warmth inside the home depended on the fire, and the fire depended on the wood. Every decision was intertwined. Even the social structure of Viking life supported this. Longhouses were shared by extended families, pooling resources, labor, and knowledge. Isolation was impossible. Survival demanded cooperation. Elders taught young ones the exact timing to cut wood, how to repair thatch in winter storms, and how to construct a hearth that would maximize warmth while minimizing smoke inhalation. Games, stories, and social rituals were timed around the hearth, preserving morale and continuity during months of darkness. Yet Vikings were not immune to the elements. Storms could trap communities for days, and blizzards made travel dangerous. Illness could spread, and frostbite was a constant risk. But by blending architecture, human ingenuity, community, and ritual, Viking homes became sanctuaries of warmth, almost magical in their efficiency. They provide a blueprint, even today, for passive heating, thermal resilience, and ecological design. And this story is only the beginning, because for centuries, Arctic and subarctic civilizations developed ways to manipulate heat, light, and airflow, lessons lost, rediscovered, and adapted by modern engineers. From Iceland to Greenland, from Norway to northern Scotland, the Vikings left traces of this mastery in ruins, in texts, and in surviving longhouses. Archaeologists, historians, and climatologists still marvel at their ability to thrive where modern people would struggle even with central heating. Sleep through a Viking winter was not just comfort, it was survival engineered into every element of domestic life. Even in -30-degree temperatures, homes never froze because the inhabitants understood what physics, biology, and community would later describe scientifically. And more remains. Beyond heat, beyond walls and hearths, Vikings mastered storage, food preservation, ventilation, and even seasonal psychology, crafting lives that aligned with the rhythm of Arctic darkness. They thrived socially and psychologically in a world that to outsiders seemed inhabitable. This is why we study them, not for bloodshed or conquest, but for insight, for a window into how humans adapt to extreme environments, for the secrets of warmth, survival, and ingenuity passed down through centuries, lessons that modern life can still illuminate if we pay attention. The winter outside may rage, the ice may spread, the auroras dance across the black Arctic sky. But inside, Viking homes remain sanctuaries, defying the frost, a testament to human innovation, care, and understanding. Even as the snow piled higher, reaching rooftops and partially burying fences, inside the longhouses the air remained steady. It was not just warmth that the Vikings preserved, it was life itself. Children played on fur-laden floors without shivering. Elders napped near the hearth without chill creeping into their bones. And animals dozed in corners, sharing heat silently. The hearth, deceptively modest, was central to this miracle. Its design was a triumph of empirical science, honed over centuries. Smoke escaped upward through the thatch, creating a rising curtain of warm air that insulated the interior. Ashes were carefully tended, smoldering overnight to maintain residual heat, releasing gentle warmth without suffocating the household. Every ember was precious, every log counted. Ventilation was another form of magic. Openings were positioned not to invite frost, but to allow fresh air to circulate, preventing moisture buildup that could freeze into ice. Moss, reeds, and animal hides sealed gaps, forming natural draft stoppers. The Vikings understood that stagnant air led to sickness and ice alike. Their homes breathed slowly, like living organisms, balancing temperature, humidity, and human occupancy with uncanny precision. Beyond the hearth, strategic furniture placement reinforced this system. Sleeping platforms elevated on wooden frames caught rising warmth. Storage lofts above hearths kept food and valuables dry and temperate. Walls thick with turf retained heat yet remained permeable to air, a natural heat exchanger long before the term existed. Clothing and bedding were as carefully engineered as the home itself. Layers of wool, linen, and fur trapped air, creating microclimates around each body. Footwear stuffed with dried moss insulated against freezing floors. Children's beds were often raised and aligned near the fire, maximizing warmth while minimizing exposure to cold drafts. Every piece of fabric, every animal hide served dual purposes, comfort and survival. Yet the true genius lay in the orchestration of daily life. Food preparation was also heat management. Cooking fires were kept active for hours, their warmth circulating naturally. The act of cooking fed the body and the home alike. Daily chores, hauling wood, tending animals, repairing roofs, were sequenced to maintain heat efficiency. Even leisure, storytelling, weaving, and games was practiced near thermal hotspots. Food storage techniques enhanced this thermal strategy. Vikings preserved meat through drying, salting, or smoking, which prevented spoilage while conserving heat within storage areas. Fish was hung in lofts, utilizing warm air currents for gentle curing. Grains were stored in insulated bins, often lined with moss, to prevent freezing and maintain digestibility during months of darkness. The seasonal rhythm of life was equally critical. During autumn, homes were prepared for the long Arctic winter. Turf roofs thickened, floors layered with rushes and hides. Firewood stockpiled meticulously, accounting for months when travel to forests would be impossible. Seasonal hunting provided both nutrition and fur for insulation, integrating survival with domestic comfort. Community also played a role in survival. Longhouses were not isolated, villages cooperated. Knowledge was shared about optimal heating, insulation, and winter preparedness. Visiting neighbors could exchange techniques, share firewood, or trade resources. Even festivals and rituals reinforced community cohesion, bolstering morale against the oppressive darkness. Psychological adaptation was intertwined with architecture. Light management, though rudimentary, mattered. Fires, torches, and reflective surfaces were used to extend daylight artificially. The design of interiors focused on minimizing shadows and fostering a perception of warmth and safety. The long, dark winters required not just physical comfort, but mental resilience, and Viking homes provided both. The most extraordinary aspect, perhaps, was how Vikings optimized every element without modern understanding. They instinctively applied principles we now recognize as thermodynamics and passive heating. Heat stratification, insulation, ventilation, and energy efficiency were all embedded in their cultural practices. Modern engineers studying Viking ruins are astonished. They note that even with minimal materials and simple tools, these homes maintained livable temperatures while enduring Arctic extremes. It was not luck, it was centuries of accumulated empirical knowledge, meticulously tested and transmitted. Food, fire, architecture, and social structure formed a harmonious system. Nothing existed in isolation. The hearth warmed the home, the animals contributed heat, the building materials stored warmth, and the human occupants optimized their movements and routines. Every winter night in a Viking home was a testament to this mastery. Families lived, children played, and communities persisted, not just existing, but flourishing in the Arctic.
Each hearth radiated warmth, each roof preserved it, each social ritual reinforced it. And this is only the beginning of understanding why Viking homes never froze, even in Arctic winters, and how their lessons continue to inspire architectural science today.
The Arctic winters were relentless. Snowdrifts piled against the longhouses, wind howled across frozen fjords, and the night could stretch for weeks, the sky painted only by the flickering auroras. Yet inside the homes, the Vikings moved with calm precision, as if they were in a climate entirely their own. The secret was not merely insulation, nor the hearth, but an intricate layering of knowledge, timing, and daily ritual that balanced human physiology against the extreme environment. Food was central to this survival. Winter stores were carefully calculated, each barrel of dried fish, each salted piece of meat, each sack of grain rationed with precision. Smokehouses and drying racks were built near hearths, using warm air currents for curing. Surplus was stored high in insulated lofts to prevent freezing and vermin, while smaller portions were rotated regularly to maintain freshness. Every meal also served as a heat source. The act of cooking added warmth, and the thermal energy radiated throughout the house. Psychological resilience was cultivated through daily structure. Even in the darkness of December, chores were sequenced meticulously: cleaning, feeding animals, maintaining firewood, repairing roofs and walls. These tasks were not mere labor, they were routines that maintained both body heat and mental order. Work was divided among adults and children alike, creating purpose and agency during the long nights when lethargy could easily set in. Lighting, though rudimentary, was carefully optimized. Candles, torches, and the hearth fire reflected off wooden walls and polished metal utensils, extending perceived daylight. Shadows were minimized to prevent the oppressive sensation of darkness creeping into corners. Vikings understood that the mind could acclimate to long nights, but morale required careful management of light and warmth. Hygiene and health were also part of Arctic engineering. Smoke from the hearth prevented dampness from fostering mold or bacteria. Fresh air vents allowed circulation, reducing respiratory illness. Steam from cooking and boiling water created humidity buffers, which, combined with insulation, reduced the dryness that could sap warmth from skin and sinuses. These seemingly small interventions multiplied the effectiveness of warmth in ways modern studies now recognize as thermal physiology optimization. Viking clothing was equally sophisticated. Layers of wool, linen, and furs tracked pockets of air, creating a personal thermal microclimate. Outer cloaks were cut to allow airflow without compromising insulation. Mittens were layered, sometimes lined with moss for extra heat retention. Even the positioning of hair and head coverings was deliberate, minimizing heat loss. The human body became an integrated component of the longhouse ecosystem, harmonizing with fire, insulation, and daily routines. The architecture of the home mirrored this integration. Timber walls, sometimes thickened with earth or turf, stored thermal energy accumulated during the day. Thatched roofs layered with moss acted as both insulator and breathable membrane, releasing smoke while retaining warmth. Elevated platforms and lofts caught rising heat, while lower spaces allowed cool air to descend harmlessly. Every dimension of construction contributed to maintaining an equilibrium that could endure months of Arctic frost. Water management, too, played a critical role. Snow and ice were harvested and stored, melting gradually to provide potable water. Drainage systems ensured that melting snow or condensation did not flood floors or freeze into hazardous ice patches. Vikings observed seasonal patterns for precipitation and frost cycles, timing the sealing of doors, windows, and turf roofs to match environmental stress. These observations were empirical, tested over decades, refined over generations. Community was another key factor.
No household existed in isolation. Villages coordinated winter preparedness, sharing firewood, livestock, and labor. Festivals, storytelling, and collective work reinforced cohesion, preventing the psychological strain of isolation from becoming debilitating. Social networks were extensions of survival strategy, where collaboration amplified the effectiveness of each individual household. Even recreation was functional. Games, songs, and storytelling served as subtle tools for regulating circadian rhythms, maintaining alertness, and reinforcing collective memory. In darkness, these activities provided structure and purpose, ensuring that mental fatigue did not compound physical exposure to cold. Human behavior was intertwined with environmental management in ways that modern architects and psychologists are still discovering. The cumulative effect of these practices is astonishing. Archaeological evidence shows Viking longhouses maintained livable conditions even under extreme cold, with minimal fuel use. Hearth placement, insulation, clothing, storage, social structure, and daily routines coalesced into a system that combined passive heating, efficient energy use, and psychological resilience. Families thrived where modern people might struggle to survive with central heating and electricity. Even the selection of building materials displayed careful observation of the environment. Timber was chosen for density and resin content. Turf thickness was calculated empirically for insulation. Moss, reeds, and other natural materials were applied as seals against wind and moisture. Each home represented centuries of knowledge accumulated through trial, error, and survival. And yet Vikings were not mere passive reactors to the Arctic. They were innovators. Adjustments were made seasonally, daily, and even hourly. If wind patterns shifted, doors and furniture were repositioned. If a hearth burned too hot, embers were moved to secondary fires. The interior microclimate was constantly monitored, and humans, animals, and heat sources all contributed to a living system. The astonishing reality is that modern engineering, with thermodynamics and HVAC systems, has had to rediscover many of these principles. Heat stratification, passive insulation, and integrated living environments are now studied, yet Vikings applied them instinctively, guided by observation and necessity rather than formula. The long Arctic winters posed not just physical challenges, but psychological ones. Months of darkness could lead to despair. Isolation could sap morale. Vikings mitigated these threats through architectural, social, and ritual means. Their homes became sanctuaries not only from frost, but from the cognitive and emotional challenges of Arctic life. Food, warmth, light, social cohesion, and daily ritual coalesced into a holistic system. No element could be neglected without risk. Failure to maintain fire, improper insulation, neglecting social duties, all had consequences that could extend beyond discomfort to illness or death. Survival was a collective and cumulative achievement. This synergy explains the remarkable fact that Viking homes never froze, not because of luck or myth, but because centuries of empirical knowledge, careful observation, and disciplined community practice ensured that life continued even in the harshest Arctic conditions. And beyond the walls, the world of Vikings continued to shape their mastery. Trade networks brought knowledge of distant materials, ships carried innovations from other coasts, and raids, explorations, and settlements across Scandinavia and Greenland tested and refined their architectural and social strategies. By blending environment, architecture, human behavior, and social cohesion, Vikings achieved something that modern society admires but rarely replicates: a warm, safe, and thriving domestic life in a world that modern imagination often considers uninhabitable.
Viking winters were not merely cold, they were oppressive, unrelenting stretches of darkness, ice, and snow. Yet longhouses remained remarkably warm. Part of this miracle lay in their understanding of microclimates, tiny, controllable zones of warmth inside the home. Hearth placement created convective loops. Warm air rose to sleeping lofts, circulated around storage areas, and gradually descended, keeping floors tolerable without overheating central areas. The fire was both furnace and central nervous system of the home. Food preservation techniques were equally advanced. Meat, fish, and dairy were salted, smoked, or dried to withstand months of freezing temperatures. Smokehouses were strategically placed near the hearth, so warm air assisted the curing process without introducing moisture that could spoil the food. Barrels were layered with moss and stored above the hearth, utilizing rising heat currents for gentle preservation. Even ice and snow were harvested and used to slow fermentation and decay, an Arctic refrigeration system long before electricity existed. Animal heat contributed significantly. Goats, pigs, chickens, and even dogs were housed partially indoors during the coldest months. Their body heat was not wasted, it circulated subtly throughout the home, reinforcing warmth created by the hearth. Vikings instinctively understood that living beings could become integral components of thermal management and integrated animals carefully without compromising air quality or hygiene. Sleep arrangements were also strategic. Elevated sleeping platforms trapped warm air, while sleeping near animals or the hearth maximized heat retention. Children were placed nearest to the fire, elders slightly farther, but insulated by thick hides and wool blankets. Beds were layered. Rushes, straw, furs, and wool mats created barriers against cold floors. Even bedding orientation mattered, positioned to align with airflow patterns and prevent drafts. Walls and roofs were multi-layered wonders. Timber was paired with layers of turf, moss, and sometimes animal skins, creating insulation that balanced warmth retention with ventilation. Thatch roofs were sloped steeply to shed snow, but turf added weight and insulation. Small gaps in the walls and doors were intentional, preventing moisture accumulation while maintaining oxygen flow. Even small design decisions, like slightly recessed doorways or vestibules, acted as windbreakers and buffers. Extreme storms were anticipated. Arctic blizzards could trap entire villages. Windows were minimal and often covered with oiled cloth or animal hides, allowing light without frost penetration. Roofs were inspected frequently, patched preemptively, and reinforced to withstand weight of heavy snow. Hearth embers were banked at night to prevent the fire from dying during severe storms, and additional logs were stored in covered racks for quick access. Daily routines reinforced warmth. Chores were sequenced to maintain heat circulation. Hauling wood, tending animals, repairing structures, and cooking were carefully scheduled. These routines prevented sudden temperature drops and ensured the hearth was continually utilized without overtaxing the inhabitants. Even social rituals, storytelling, singing, and games occurred near the fire to preserve morale and mental focus. Vikings understood psychological adaptation to darkness as much as physical adaptation. Long nights were mentally challenging, and their homes acted as safe havens, preserving both body heat and emotional equilibrium. Soft lamplight, reflective surfaces, and proximity to family members created a sense of control and safety. Even the layout of furniture encouraged communal closeness, reinforcing social bonds that were essential for survival. Thermal efficiency extended to storage areas. Grain, herbs, and dried foods were elevated and insulated with moss or straw, benefiting from residual heat while remaining dry. Smoke from the hearth passed nearby without contamination, aiding preservation. The clever layering of storage, animal heat, and human activity created a home that seemed alive, constantly regulating itself in harmony with extreme external conditions. Hygiene and moisture management were integral.
Snow tracked in was brushed off immediately, floors were covered in rushes and straw to absorb dampness, and smoke circulation reduced mold and bacteria growth. These practices ensured that warmth was maintained efficiently without risking health. Vikings essentially engineered the first integrated domestic climate system, combining biology, architecture, and social behavior. Even minor design elements were intentional. Doorways were slightly narrower to reduce wind infiltration. Loft beams were spaced to promote airflow while preventing cold drafts. Hearthstones absorbed heat during the day and released it slowly at night. Each choice reflected generations of empirical observation, refined through trial and necessity. The result was astonishing. Humans living comfortably in one of the coldest regions on Earth, with minimal energy input, using only natural materials, animals, and carefully orchestrated routines. Modern studies confirm that Viking homes maintained internal temperatures far above external averages, even in Arctic winters of -30 degrees Celsius or lower. And yet their mastery went beyond mere survival. Vikings engineered a lifestyle that preserved social cohesion, mental health, and seasonal productivity. Work, play, sleep, and food preparation were intertwined into a sustainable rhythm. Nothing was wasted, nothing accidental. Every ember, every layer of turf, every sleeping position, every loaf of dried fish contributed to a finely tuned system of survival and domestic comfort. The ingenuity is almost poetic. Longhouses were not static, they were responsive, living environments shaped by knowledge, observation, and care. Fire, insulation, airflow, animal heat, human routines, and social cohesion fused into a seamless whole, making freezing impossible within these Arctic sanctuaries. This is why Viking homes continue to fascinate historians, architects, and survivalists. They were more than shelters. They were engineered ecosystems, tailored to human needs, environmental extremes, and seasonal rhythms. Their lessons echo into modern passive housing, ecological design, and thermal management, centuries ahead of their time.
Even in the depths of the Arctic winter, a Viking longhouse was a marvel of hidden sophistication. At first glance, it seemed simple: timber walls, turf roof, central hearth. But beneath that simplicity lay layers of clever design and subtle environmental engineering, accumulated over generations. One secret was the rotation of space. Longhouses were divided into zones that served multiple purposes depending on the season. In the deepest winter, sleeping lofts and raised platforms were prioritized for warmth. Kitchens and animal pens shifted closer to living areas, and storage spaces were strategically positioned to benefit from rising heat. These movements were subtle, shifts of furniture, rearrangement of bedding, moving of animals, but they optimized the interior climate in ways modern architects would recognize as passive thermal zoning. Fire management was another art. Hearths were not merely for cooking or warmth, they were instruments of controlled energy. Embers were banked overnight, logs cut to specific lengths to maximize burn time, and placement of pots and ovens near the hearth circulated heat throughout the home. Vikings understood that heat distribution required timing as much as intensity. Too much fire could overheat and waste resources. Too little and frost would creep into floors and walls. The balance was learned empirically over decades. Walls, floors, and ceilings were engineered for hidden airflow. Small vents, often covered with moss or hides, directed warm air to lofts or storage spaces. Smoke didn't just exit the building, it was guided to circulate gently through the upper spaces before leaving through the thatch, subtly warming sleeping areas. Floors layered with rushes, straw, and animal hides created insulation while allowing minor ventilation, preventing moisture accumulation and ice formation. The thatch roof itself was a silent miracle.
Layered turf and reeds trapped heat, while steep slopes shed heavy snow. The weight of the turf added stability, but also served as thermal mass, absorbing heat from the interior and releasing it slowly throughout the night. Slight overhangs prevented cold air from intruding near doorways, and ridge beams were positioned to maximize structural efficiency while preserving interior airflow. Vikings also designed for psychological resilience. Long nights of darkness could be demoralizing. Hearths, sleeping arrangements, and even wall decorations, simple tapestries, polished shields, or functional tools, were arranged to make interiors feel safe and lively. Families clustered together near sources of heat and light, reinforcing bonds that were essential to maintain morale. Storytelling, singing, and games were strategically timed to coincide with the coldest hours of the winter, providing structured activity that kept spirits high. The integration of animals was subtle yet critical. Animals were not simply livestock, they were heat generators, social companions, and storage aids. Goats, pigs, and dogs were housed near living spaces, their body heat contributing to the ambient warmth. Livestock pens doubled as insulation buffers, creating layers of microclimates that helped maintain overall thermal balance. This symbiosis was an unspoken system, taught orally, observed closely, and refined over generations. Vikings also practiced seasonal preparation for extreme cold with unmatched foresight. Timber, peat, and firewood were cut and stacked long before winter set in, positioned near the hearth for easy access. Snow and ice were harvested to create temporary refrigeration systems for certain foods, and moisture-sensitive items were stored strategically to prevent freezing or spoilage. This careful orchestration of resources and timing ensured that the home's warmth was not just maintained, but optimized continuously. Architectural details, like door vestibules, were more than aesthetic. They acted as thermal buffers, preventing cold air from entering directly and warm air from escaping. Doors were often double-planked, sometimes covered with hides, reducing heat loss significantly. Even small interior adjustments, such as moving beds or storage bins closer to the hearth during severe cold snaps, demonstrated an intuitive understanding of heat flow and energy management. Vikings observed environmental patterns meticulously. They timed chores, cooking, and maintenance according to wind direction, snow accumulation, and daylight hours. Their empirical knowledge of seasonal changes was embedded in daily life. For example, snowdrifts against a wall could be used as insulation, while certain wind directions indicated when to reinforce doors or adjust the hearth. These insights were passed orally from elder to child, preserving decades of survival knowledge. Social cooperation reinforced architectural and thermal efficiency. Villages shared labor, resources, and knowledge, ensuring that no household bore the burden alone. This cooperative approach extended to festivals and rituals, which were timed to reinforce both social cohesion and morale during the longest and darkest stretches of winter. The home was therefore part of a wider survival ecosystem, connected to neighbors, animals, and the natural environment. Perhaps most astonishing was the integration of multi-generational knowledge. Children learned from observing and participating. Every routine, chopping wood, tending hearths, storing food, caring for animals, was a lesson in survival, heating, and efficiency. Knowledge was never written down, but lived, observed, corrected, and perfected. By adulthood, every Viking understood not only their own home, but the principles that applied to any dwelling in Arctic conditions. The cumulative effect was staggering. Homes that never froze, even in Arctic winters, using only natural materials, observation, and human ingenuity. Families thrived physically, psychologically, and socially, forming a resilient network of survival, comfort, and innovation. Every ember,
Every turf layer, every sleeping platform, every animal was part of a harmonious system ensuring warmth, productivity, and well-being. Even modern studies of archaeological longhouses reveal subtle engineering that would be impressive today. Heat retention, air circulation, moisture control, and passive energy management. The Vikings achieved in practice what modern architecture struggles to replicate centuries ahead of time. And the lessons go further. By examining their homes, routines, and social structures, we glimpse not only how humans survived extreme climates, but also how culture, cooperation, and observation can combine to create environments that are both comfortable and resilient, even under the harshest conditions.
Outside the longhouse, the Arctic world was merciless. Snowfields stretched endlessly. The wind cut through the air with sharp precision, and temperatures could plunge beyond what most humans today could endure without technology. Yet Vikings moved through this landscape with confidence, guided by an intimate understanding of the environment and the knowledge inherited over generations. Travel and navigation in winter required extreme precision. Paths were memorized, landmarks observed in detail, and the aurora borealis itself sometimes served as a reference. Slopes were studied for snow accumulation, ice thickness measured carefully before crossing. Even clothing and footwear were engineered for extended exposure. Layering of wool, fur, and moss ensured warmth, while boots with thick moss soles insulated against frozen ground. Community survival extended beyond individual longhouses. Villages functioned as coordinated networks. If a blizzard struck, neighbors checked on each other, shared firewood, and assisted with livestock. Temporary shelters were erected along common paths, and communal work ensured that no single household was overexposed to risk. Social cohesion was therefore an essential survival tool, integrated seamlessly into daily routines. Cross-generational knowledge transfer was vital. Children observed and participated in chores from an early age. They learned not only to chop wood and maintain fires, but also to read wind, snow patterns, and ice conditions. Elders guided these lessons orally, correcting errors, refining timing, and transmitting subtle cues that would ensure survival. By adolescence, the young understood the complex interaction between architecture, environment, and routine. Survival was both a science and an art, honed through direct experience rather than written manuals. Inside the longhouse, winter nights were long and dark. Families maintained activity patterns to reinforce thermal balance and mental well-being. Cooking, storytelling, weaving, and games were timed strategically. Children slept near the hearth, elders rested on elevated platforms, and animals occupied transitional zones, contributing warmth while providing companionship. These micro-strategies reinforced both physiological resilience and psychological fortitude. Even emergency situations were anticipated and mitigated. Heavy snowfall could block entrances, and the longhouse's roof was designed to shed weight efficiently. Backup firewood was stored in accessible areas, embers banked overnight, and multiple hearths sometimes operated in larger households to distribute heat effectively. Longhouses acted as both home and fortress, providing security from the elements and continuity of daily life. The lessons embedded in Viking homes extend into modern architecture. Passive heating, airflow management, thermal mass, insulation layering, and microclimate creation are all principles that contemporary engineers now rediscover in the study of ancient longhouses. These homes were sustainable, low energy, and highly adaptive, built not with modern tools, but with knowledge, observation, and careful orchestration of resources. Furthermore, the Vikings' approach highlights the importance of community in environmental adaptation.
Homes did not exist in isolation. Knowledge, labor, and resources were shared. Festivals and communal gatherings were not frivolous. They reinforced cooperation and transmitted practical wisdom. Social cohesion amplified the survival capabilities of each household, demonstrating the inseparable link between social structure and environmental mastery. Even in extreme cold, food systems remained reliable. Preservation techniques, storage strategies, and heat integration ensured that families could maintain both nutrition and warmth. Dried fish, salted meat, stored grains, and smoked dairy products were arranged with precision, often using passive heat to prevent freezing or spoilage. Culinary routines became thermal strategies, and every meal contributed to the ecosystem of the home. Vikings' mastery of the Arctic environment was holistic. Architecture, clothing, food, fire, social systems, and psychological routines were all integrated into a single survival strategy. Knowledge was empirical, iterative, and cumulative. Mistakes were corrected in real time. Successes were preserved through observation and oral transmission. The result? Homes that never froze, families that thrived, and communities that endured where lesser systems would fail. The enduring lesson is that survival in extreme environments requires both practical innovation and social intelligence. Vikings demonstrated that human ingenuity can overcome environmental severity when architecture, routine, and community work in harmony. Modern studies of longhouses, materials, and social structures continue to uncover principles of passive heating, energy efficiency, and resilient design that are directly relevant today. Every aspect of life inside a Viking longhouse was an orchestrated interaction with the environment. Fire, insulation, animals, sleeping arrangements, food, and social rituals combined to create a living system, warm, resilient, and adaptive. The homes were more than shelters. They were frameworks for survival, psychological well-being, and communal strength. Even today, archaeologists, architects, and historians marvel at the sophistication of these structures. What appears simple at first glance is in fact a highly optimized environment, the product of centuries of empirical observation, shared knowledge, and human ingenuity. Viking longhouses represent one of history's most extraordinary examples of passive environmental mastery, offering lessons in sustainability, resilience, and adaptation that remain relevant in modern contexts.
As winter deepened, storms could rage for days without pause. Snow fell relentlessly, wind whipped against the longhouse walls, and the Arctic night seemed eternal. Yet inside, the Vikings remained warm, fed, and alert. Their mastery of fire, insulation, and household organization allowed them not only to survive, but to maintain a rhythm of life that sustained both body and mind. Seasonal rituals were as functional as they were cultural. Hearth cleaning, roof inspection, and food rotation were tied to festivals and communal gatherings, providing structure during months of darkness. These activities reinforced skill transmission, social cohesion, and mental resilience. Storytelling and song kept children and adults engaged, their attention directed away from the oppressive cold outside. The home became both a physical and psychological sanctuary. Fire management reached near artistic levels. Hearths were positioned for optimal airflow, embers banked carefully, and multiple cooking fires distributed heat throughout the interior. Logs were cut to exact lengths, chosen for density and burn time, and ash was preserved to insulate floors or protect stored food from freezing. Smoke was guided through the thatch to enhance warmth while preventing dangerous accumulation, a subtle balance of thermal engineering and intuition. Insulation strategies were equally sophisticated. Walls, roofs, and floors combined timber, turf, moss, and animal hides in multi-layer systems that trapped heat while allowing moisture to escape. Sleeping platforms were elevated to catch rising warmth, and bedding was layered with furs, rushes, and straw to prevent heat loss. Small design features, recessed doors, vestibules, and strategically placed animal pens further optimized internal microclimates, creating spaces that remained livable even under extreme Arctic conditions. Animals were integrated as living heaters. Goats, pigs, and dogs were housed near sleeping areas, their body heat contributing to ambient warmth. Their movement and breathing created gentle air circulation, complementing the passive heating from the hearth. The Vikings understood that living beings were part of the thermal ecosystem, and they used this knowledge to maximize comfort and efficiency. Even during storms, food and water management remained precise. Snow was harvested and used for slow refrigeration. Salted and smoked foods were rotated to prevent spoilage. Fire-heated lofts preserved perishable items. Every routine, every action was calibrated to maintain an environment where freezing was impossible. Social coordination amplified survival. Villages shared labor and resources, ensuring that no household faced extreme conditions alone. Communal barns, temporary shelters, and shared stockpiles created redundancy in the system. Festivals, games, and storytelling were timed to reinforce morale and strengthen bonds, essential for sustaining human activity during long months of darkness. Psychological resilience was central. The design of the longhouse, placement of beds, lighting, and hearth position all contributed to a sense of safety. Darkness outside was mitigated by warm light, proximity to family, and structured activity. The interior environment was orchestrated to maintain both warmth and emotional well-being, allowing humans to endure the extremes of Arctic winter without despair. The integration of all these elements, fire, insulation, airflow, animal heat, food preservation, social routines, and seasonal rituals formed a unified survival system. It was empirical knowledge refined over centuries, tested under harsh conditions, and transmitted orally across generations. Each longhouse was a living experiment, constantly adjusted to maximize thermal comfort, social cohesion, and human endurance. Even modern research acknowledges the sophistication. Archaeologists studying ruins are amazed at how homes remained above freezing, how heat distribution worked efficiently, and how communities survived in the absence of modern technology. Engineers and designers now study these homes for insights into passive heating, energy efficiency, and sustainable architecture. Vikings achieved what many today consider impossible. In a world of relentless cold, they created warmth, maintained food, ensured health, preserved morale, and built a lifestyle that thrived. The harmony between architecture, environment, social practice, and ritual was complete, allowing humans not merely to exist, but to flourish in one of the harshest climates on Earth. The long Arctic nights, the blizzards, the frozen fjords all became part of a life system, orchestrated around knowledge, observation, and careful routine. Every ember, every layer of turf, every sleeping position, every animal, and every human action was part of an intricate web of survival. By the time spring approached, longhouses remained intact, food was preserved, families healthy, and communities cohesive. Proof of the genius woven into Viking domestic life. In the end, Viking homes were more than shelters. They were ecosystems, integrated, adaptive, and resilient. They harmonized human activity, environmental conditions, and social structures into a living framework capable of sustaining life under extreme conditions. These lessons echo across centuries, offering insights into survival, architecture, and the power of human ingenuity when guided by observation, experience, and cooperation.
Winter had deepened to its fiercest form. The sun barely crested the horizon, and the Arctic darkness pressed down on villages like a living entity.
Outside, snowdrifts swallowed fences and frozen fjords glimmered with an icy menace. Yet inside, the longhouses remained sanctuaries of warmth and life, a testament to centuries of Viking ingenuity. This part of the story reveals one of the most astonishing aspects of Viking survival, hidden structural adaptations that modern eyes would never expect. Walls were not uniform timber. They were layered with peat, moss, and tightly packed reeds, creating a composite insulation that trapped heat while allowing moisture to escape. The placement of posts and beams was precise, ensuring minimal thermal bridging and maximizing stability under heavy snow loads. Every timber was chosen for density, resin content, and resistance to frost, a selection process that was meticulous and empirically guided. Animal integration was not limited to passive heat. Chickens, goats, and dogs were deliberately placed to create microclimates. Their movement and body warmth produced subtle air circulation patterns, reducing dampness and preventing freezing near sleeping areas. Humans, animals, hearths, and architecture formed a single interdependent system. Even the hearths were engineered for maximum efficiency. Logs were cut to exact dimensions, stacked carefully to burn evenly, and embers banked overnight to maintain a slow, steady heat. Hearthstones absorbed and radiated warmth, their placement calculated so that heat could reach elevated sleeping platforms, storage lofts, and work areas. Smoke, far from being a nuisance, was guided through the roof thatch to create an insulating warm layer, leaving the air breathable below. Vikings also optimized seasonal microclimates. Lofts were used for storage and sleeping in winter, but in autumn or spring, the same spaces were rearranged to accommodate drying fish, curing meat, or storing peat and timber. Beds and furniture were moved to maximize exposure to residual heat, and animals were rotated to align with airflow patterns. Every element had a dual or triple function depending on the season. Food preservation was an art form. Fish and meat were dried, salted, or smoked in controlled microenvironments. Lofts and storage rooms were designed to maintain temperature just above freezing but below spoilage thresholds. Snow and ice were harvested, layered with straw or moss, and used as primitive refrigeration. Every movement of food within the house contributed to temperature regulation, demonstrating an intuitive understanding of heat, insulation, and airflow. Even mental resilience was carefully cultivated. During months of near-constant darkness, interior design, social structure, and daily routines reinforced a sense of safety and control. Light from the hearth, reflections from polished metal tools, and even the rhythmic patterns of household chores created a perception of continuity, safety, and warmth. Storytelling, songs, and games were timed to counteract psychological fatigue, ensuring that humans remained alert, engaged, and cooperative. Extreme storms tested these systems. Windows were minimal, doors double-planked, and vestibules served as buffers against wind-driven snow. Roofs were steeply pitched to shed snow, reinforced with turf and moss, and checked daily. Embers were banked, and secondary fires maintained to prevent sudden heat loss. Even minor structural adjustments, moving furniture, rearranging beds, or temporarily relocating animals, could mean the difference between comfort and frostbite. Vikings' holistic approach combined architecture, social structure, daily routines, food preservation, and environmental awareness into one integrated survival system. Every longhouse was a living organism, balancing thermal dynamics, psychological needs, and resource management. Communities shared labor and knowledge, ensuring that no individual or household was left vulnerable.
Modern archaeologists are still astonished. Heat mapping of reconstructed longhouses shows remarkable efficiency. Internal temperatures often exceeded 20 degrees Celsius, while outside temperatures plummeted below -30. Humidity levels were regulated naturally, airflow optimized, and food preserved without modern refrigeration. The Vikings achieved what modern engineers only attempt to recreate with complex HVAC systems, insulated walls, and sophisticated sensors. In short, Arctic winters were no match for Viking knowledge. Their longhouses were warm, their food preserved, their minds resilient, and their communities cohesive. Even in conditions that would cripple unprepared humans, they thrived, proof that centuries of observation, experimentation, and cultural transmission could create a living system more efficient than most modern constructions. And beyond the walls, the Vikings extended this mastery to travel, trade, and settlement in Greenland, Iceland, and beyond. Every innovation inside the longhouse, hearth design, insulation layering, microclimate management, and social coordination had applications in survival during journeys, fishing expeditions, and harsh outdoor labor. The principles learned inside were tested and refined in the extreme environment outside.
Winter in the Viking North was not merely a season, it was a relentless teacher, shaping every action, every decision, and every structure. As storms swept across frozen fjords and snowdrifts accumulated to swallow fences, longhouses stood as islands of warmth, order, and life. But the survival of Vikings was not confined to the safety of their homes. Winter exploration, hunting, trading, and even raiding required the same mastery of the Arctic environment that kept their interiors frost-free. Travel in winter demanded extraordinary preparation. Paths were memorized down to individual rocks and tree stumps, known landmarks recorded mentally over years of observation. Snow accumulation, wind direction, ice thickness, and the movement of the sun, or its absence, dictated the timing of journeys. Footwear was layered, often with moss between insoles and boots to insulate against frozen ground, while clothing was tailored to trap air in multiple layers. Reindeer and sled dogs were sometimes used, providing not only transport but also heat and companionship on long, treacherous journeys. Navigation relied on subtle environmental cues. Aurora borealis, the position of the stars, snowdrifts, and the direction of frozen rivers all served as guides. The Vikings developed an intuitive sense of seasonal change, how ice would thicken, where hidden crevices and frozen lakes lay, which snowdrifts were likely to shift during storms. This knowledge was not written, it was observed, measured in human survival, and transmitted orally through generations. Inside the longhouse, fire mastery was equally crucial for both survival and psychological well-being. Hearths were positioned at the heart of the structure, designed for maximum convective heat. Logs were selected for density and burn rate, cut to precise lengths, and banked carefully overnight. Embers were layered under ash to maintain slow, constant warmth, and secondary hearths often supported larger households, distributing heat throughout lofts, sleeping platforms, and storage areas. Smoke was guided subtly through the roof thatch, creating an insulating warm layer above while keeping the air breathable below. Seasonal microclimates within the home allowed Vikings to rotate activities, animals, and even storage. Sleeping platforms were elevated to catch rising warmth, while animal pens were positioned to maximize heat contribution. Kitchens and cooking areas served dual purposes, preparing food and circulating warmth. Lofts and storage spaces were arranged to take advantage of passive heat, ensuring that stored grains, salted meat, and dried fish remained preserved even in sub-zero temperatures. Every movement, every routine was a calculated part of thermal management. Food preservation was both science and art. Fish and meat were cured using carefully controlled heat from hearths and smoke. Grains were stored in moss-insulated bins to prevent freezing, while snow and ice harvested from outside served as primitive refrigeration. Temperature, moisture, and airflow were all monitored through observation and experience, rather than instruments, yet the results rivaled modern refrigeration in effectiveness. Community-level strategies amplified survival. Villages functioned as coordinated networks where labor, food, firewood, and knowledge were shared. During blizzards, neighbors checked on each other, reinforced roofs, and helped manage livestock. Temporary shelters were built along commonly traveled paths for emergencies. Festivals, storytelling, and communal work reinforced cohesion, ensuring that social bonds and morale remained strong even during the darkest periods of winter. Mental resilience was a deliberate product of design and routine. Long Arctic nights could sap human willpower, yet Vikings cultivated psychological endurance through structured activity, light management, and social rituals. The hearth was central not only for warmth, but also for emotional grounding. Light reflected from polished utensils, shields, and metallic tools extended perception of daylight. Storytelling, songs, and games were strategically timed to counteract the oppressive darkness. Families slept close together, animals were integrated into sleeping areas, and elevated sleeping platforms preserved warmth, creating both comfort and security. Architectural subtleties revealed astonishing foresight. Vestibules prevented cold air from directly entering living spaces. Roof slopes were designed to shed snow, reinforced with turf and moss, yet ventilated to allow smoke escape. Timber, peat, moss, and reeds were layered in walls to trap heat while preventing moisture accumulation. Even minor adjustments, repositioning beds, rotating animals, or moving firewood were part of a continuous micromanagement system to optimize warmth and air quality. Vikings also mastered disaster preparedness. Heavy snowfall, ice accumulation, or sudden windstorms were anticipated. Secondary hearths could provide backup heat, additional firewood was stored nearby, and livestock were strategically housed to maximize heat contribution while maintaining health. Families and communities had plans for worst-case scenarios, demonstrating an integrated approach to survival that combined architecture, social cohesion, and environmental intelligence. Every day was an experiment in balance. The internal ecosystem of the longhouse required careful orchestration. Heat, insulation, airflow, animals, food, social routines, and psychological well-being all interacted. Mismanagement of any component could compromise safety, warmth, or food preservation. The Viking survival system was therefore both intricate and elegant, combining centuries of empirical knowledge into a harmonious living environment. The most extraordinary aspect is the integration of human, animal, and environmental energy. Humans contributed heat through activity, animals through body warmth, hearths through fire, and architecture through insulation and airflow. Food preparation and storage enhanced the thermal system, and communal activity reinforced social stability. Every action had multiple effects, creating a network of interdependent survival strategies that kept freezing at bay and allowed life to flourish. Even modern studies confirm this efficiency. Reconstructed longhouses with heat mapping show internal temperatures far above external averages. Moisture levels are balanced, airflow optimized, and food preserved effectively without electricity or modern technology. Vikings achieved in practice what passive heating engineers and sustainability architects study today. And yet, survival was only part of the story. The Vikings thrived. Seasonal festivals, rituals, and practical games reinforced skills, morale, and social bonds. Knowledge was transmitted orally, refined continuously, and adjusted according to environmental feedback. Each longhouse was a living system, warm, secure, and resilient, even as the Arctic raged outside.
In essence, the Vikings created a symphony of survival. Architecture, fire, insulation, airflow, animal heat, food preservation, social organization, seasonal rituals, and psychological strategies blended seamlessly into a system that sustained life through the harshest winters imaginable. Their homes were more than shelters. They were ecosystems, finely tuned instruments of survival that harmonized with the environment, the inhabitants, and the community.
Winter in the Arctic was both a calendar and a teacher. The sun barely rose above the horizon, yet the Vikings orchestrated life with precise timing, guided by the rhythm of snow, ice, wind, and frost. Festivals and seasonal rituals were not merely cultural expressions, they were integral to survival. They reinforced community cohesion, ensured continuity of skills, and maintained mental fortitude during months when darkness dominated. The Midwinter Festival, known in various regions as Yule, was timed to align with the winter solstice. Homes were meticulously prepared, hearths cleaned, firewood arranged for maximum efficiency, and stored food rotated. Families came together in longhouses, the central hearth ablaze, sharing tales of voyages, hunts, and ancestral exploits. Storytelling was not merely entertainment, it reinforced knowledge about survival, navigation, animal behavior, and environmental patterns, ensuring the young absorbed practical wisdom alongside moral and cultural values. Animals played multiple roles during these festivals. Livestock were often brought indoors temporarily, not only for heat contribution, but also to maintain morale. Children observed how animal heat influenced room temperature, learning the importance of microclimate management. Adults rotated animals strategically to maintain airflow and prevent moisture accumulation while maximizing warmth. Even the placement of each goat, pig, or dog was deliberate, reflecting centuries of empirical knowledge about thermal efficiency. Food was central to survival and celebration. Preserved meats, salted fish, dried berries, smoked dairy, and grains stored in moss-lined bins were distributed carefully. Cooking fires generated heat and light, and ovens positioned near sleeping lofts created thermal currents that reached elevated platforms. Meals were carefully rationed, with portions rotated to prevent spoilage while maintaining caloric intake for harsh outdoor activities. Vikings understood that winter survival required both sustenance and warmth, and food systems were designed accordingly. Extreme outdoor survival demanded equal mastery. Hunters and fishermen venturing across frozen fjords or snow-covered plains wore multiple layers of wool, fur, and linen. Moss-lined boots insulated against frozen ground, and wind-proof cloaks minimized heat loss. Sleds and reindeer were used for transport. Their movement created heat and conserved energy. Knowledge of wind patterns, snow density, and ice thickness was critical, and these skills were passed orally, tested through observation, and refined through experience. Hearths were the beating heart of both indoor and outdoor strategy. Fire mastery included banked embers, secondary hearths, and smoke circulation designed to maintain even heat while preserving air quality. Logs were meticulously chosen for density and burn time. Embers were layered under ash to release slow, steady warmth overnight. Smoke channels in the roof allowed heat to circulate into lofts and storage areas while preventing suffocation or moisture accumulation. Every ember had multiple functions: warmth, preservation, and ritual significance. Seasonal microclimates inside the longhouse allowed Vikings to rotate spaces and optimize thermal balance. Sleeping lofts, animal pens, kitchens, and storage areas were arranged based on temperature, airflow, and proximity to the hearth.
Elevated sleeping platforms trapped rising heat, while lower floors accommodated animal movement and workspaces. Lofts stored grain and cured foods, benefiting from residual heat while remaining dry. These dynamic internal adjustments ensured that freezing was impossible even during the harshest Arctic nights. Cross-generational teaching reinforced these skills. Children learned to chop wood efficiently, manage fires, rotate storage, and position animals to optimize warmth. They observed elders' routines, internalized environmental cues, and practiced critical judgment under controlled conditions. Mistakes were corrected immediately, ensuring knowledge transmission was precise, experiential, and cumulative. By adolescence, young Vikings could survive independently, navigate Arctic terrain, and maintain longhouse microclimates with minimal guidance. Community resilience extended beyond individual homes. Villages coordinated winter survival strategies, sharing labor, firewood, and food, assisting households affected by blizzards, maintaining temporary shelters along key routes, and providing mutual protection against environmental hazards. Festivals reinforced social bonds, strengthened morale, and ensured knowledge about winter survival circulated broadly. Cooperation was as essential as fire, insulation, or preserved food. It was a survival tool embedded in culture. Vikings' homes were also adaptable laboratories. Minor modifications were made daily, shifting beds, rotating animals, moving food stores, adjusting vent openings, and reinforcing turf walls. Every change impacted airflow, moisture, and temperature, demonstrating an advanced understanding of passive heating and energy management. Walls, roofs, floors, hearths, and furniture formed a responsive system, continuously adjusted to maintain optimal living conditions. Advanced storage strategies prevented loss during extreme cold. Dried fish, salted meats, and grain were stored in insulated lofts above the hearth, using warm air to prevent freezing while keeping humidity low. Moss, straw, and animal hides provided natural insulation, and smoke circulation deterred pests. Seasonal adjustments ensured that the interior remained balanced, with warm zones for sleeping and cooler zones for preservation, creating a dynamic and resilient internal environment. Extreme storms tested both architecture and social cohesion. Double-planked doors, vestibules, steep roofs, and reinforced timber protected against wind, ice, and snow load. Backup hearths and extra firewood ensured continued warmth during multi-day blizzards. Neighbors shared resources, repaired damage collaboratively, and ensured no household was isolated. Even in crisis, the combination of planning, knowledge, and social cooperation maintained both physical and psychological survival. Vikings' homes exemplified holistic environmental mastery. Architecture, fire management, insulation, airflow, animal integration, food preservation, seasonal rituals, social coordination, and mental resilience combined into a unified system. The result? Humans living comfortably in sub-zero temperatures, enduring months of darkness, thriving where others would falter. Modern studies reveal the astonishing efficiency of these homes. Heat mapping shows internal temperatures far above external averages. Passive airflow, moisture regulation, thermal mass, and animal heat integration created a sustainable, low-energy ecosystem. The Vikings achieved centuries-old environmental mastery without modern tools or written instructions, relying solely on observation, experience, and cultural transmission.
For centuries, the Arctic world of the Vikings has been wrapped in myth. Popular imagination paints them as reckless warriors who simply endured the cold through brute strength and fur cloaks. The truth is far more astonishing. Viking survival was not accidental nor heroic improvisation. It was the result of a deeply rational, long-term system designed to defeat winter before it arrived. Long before the first snowfall, winter planning began. Summer and autumn were seasons of preparation, not leisure. Timber was cut months in advance and left to season, reducing moisture so it would burn hotter and cleaner in winter. Peat and turf were harvested and dried, stacked carefully near longhouses. Food preservation accelerated as daylight shortened. Every family calculated winter needs with precision: firewood quantities, food rations, animal placement, and labor distribution, because mistakes were unforgiving in the Arctic. One of the greatest myths is that Viking homes were crude shelters. In reality, longhouses were long-term thermal investments. Their placement in the landscape was deliberate, often nestled against slopes to block prevailing winds, oriented to capture limited winter light, and surrounded by snowbanks that acted as natural insulation. Snow, rather than being an enemy, became part of the heating system. Packed against walls, it reduced heat loss and stabilized indoor temperatures. Inside, winter life followed an almost ritualized discipline. Fires were never allowed to die fully. Embers were banked each night, covered with ash to slow combustion and preserve heat. At dawn, or what passed for dawn during polar darkness, embers were revived with minimal fuel. This practice conserved wood and maintained continuous warmth. Fire was treated not as a tool, but as a living presence that demanded respect and constant attention. Extreme storms tested every element of Viking planning. Blizzards could last for days, sometimes weeks, trapping entire communities. Roofs were reinforced to handle snow load, beams selected to flex rather than snap under pressure. Thatch and turf roofs absorbed shock from wind and ice, while layered walls prevented drafts. Doorways were intentionally small and recessed, reducing wind penetration and heat loss. Vestibules acted as airlocks, trapping cold before it reached living spaces. When storms intensified, the internal organization of the longhouse shifted. Families moved closer together. Animals were brought deeper inside. Work areas shrank. Sleeping zones expanded. Furniture, bedding, and storage were rearranged to preserve core warmth. This flexibility was essential. The longhouse was not static architecture. It was a responsive organism that adapted hour by hour to environmental stress. Another myth suggests Vikings relied solely on physical toughness to endure winter. In truth, mental endurance was equally engineered. Darkness was the greatest psychological threat. Weeks without sunlight could erode morale, disrupt sleep, and weaken social bonds. Viking culture responded with structure. Daily routines, even in darkness, followed strict rhythms. Meals were shared at consistent times. Storytelling followed evening hours. Work was broken into predictable cycles. This rhythm anchored the mind when the natural clock disappeared. Social rituals were survival tools. Songs, sagas, and games were not idle entertainment. They transmitted memory, reinforced identity, and preserved knowledge. Stories often embedded practical lessons: navigation mistakes, winter disasters, successful preparations, disguised as heroic tales. Children absorbed survival strategies without formal instruction. Elders reinforced collective memory, ensuring that knowledge outlived individuals. Villages functioned as winter ecosystems. No household was independent. Firewood shortages, food loss, or roof damage were communal concerns. Neighbors shared resources and labor because isolation meant death. Temporary shelters were maintained along paths between settlements, stocked with emergency supplies. This network reduced risk during travel and ensured survival even when storms disrupted normal life. The integration between home, village, and environment was complete.
Longhouses were built not just for families, but for systems, animals, food, fire, airflow, and social interaction. Villages were positioned to share windbreaks, grazing areas, and access to water. Seasonal migration of animals was synchronized with household needs. Every decision considered thermal efficiency, labor distribution, and psychological stability. Modern researchers often marvel at one particular fact. Viking homes did not freeze solid even during extreme cold. Floors remained usable, food remained edible, water, though limited, was accessible. Human activity never stopped. This was not luck, it was systems thinking centuries before the term existed. The Arctic punished inefficiency. Any waste of fuel, food, or effort could cascade into disaster. Vikings responded with redundancy. Multiple heat sources, backup food stores, shared labor, knowledge distributed across generations. Even if one element failed, others compensated. This redundancy is a hallmark of resilient systems recognized today in engineering and disaster planning. Perhaps the most remarkable lesson lies in how seamlessly Vikings aligned culture with environment. Their architecture, rituals, social norms, and daily habits were all shaped by winter. Survival was not a seasonal struggle, it was a way of life. The longhouse was the physical expression of this philosophy, warm, adaptable, communal, and deeply intelligent. As spring eventually returned, melting snow and lengthening days revealed the success of these systems. Families emerged intact, animals survived, food stores endured, knowledge passed forward, refined again for the next winter. Each year was a test, and each generation improved upon the last. The Viking world did not conquer the Arctic through force, it understood it. And through that understanding, it built homes that did not freeze, communities that did not fracture, and cultures that endured where others failed.
Knowledge among the Vikings was never static. It moved like a river, slow, persistent, reshaping everything it touched. Each winter added new lessons. Each failure carved rules deeper into memory. Survival in the North was not inherited blindly. It was refined continuously, sharpened by loss and success alike. In Scandinavia, where forests were plentiful and winters severe but predictable, Viking systems matured early. Longhouses evolved gradually, walls thickened, roof angles changed, hearth placement improved. Small mistakes were corrected within a generation. A roof that collapsed under snow taught builders to alter pitch. A hearth that smoked too heavily taught families how to guide airflow. Knowledge moved orally, embedded in routine, ritual, and observation. But when Vikings pushed west, to Iceland and later Greenland, the environment challenged everything they thought they knew. Iceland offered fewer trees, volatile weather, and a fragile ecosystem. Here, Vikings adapted quickly. Timber became precious. Turf and stone replaced wood wherever possible. Longhouses grew lower and wider, hugging the earth to resist wind and conserve heat. Hearths were redesigned to burn peat and dried dung instead of wood. Food systems shifted heavily toward fish and dairy, as grain farming proved unreliable. In Iceland, Viking knowledge flexed and survived. Greenland was different. Greenland tested the limits of Viking adaptation. At first it seemed familiar, cold, remote, demanding, but subtle differences proved deadly over time. Trees were scarce, peat quality was poor, growing seasons were short and unpredictable. Sea ice patterns shifted slowly over generations, cutting off trade routes. Yet many Greenland settlements clung to old habits, cattle farming, European-style diets, rigid social hierarchies.
This is where Viking wisdom fractured. Instead of fully adapting to Arctic marine survival like the Inuit, who relied on seals, whales, flexible shelters, and extreme mobility, Greenland Vikings attempted to preserve older lifestyles. Longhouses remained large and resource-intensive. Cattle required fodder that became harder to produce. Fuel shortages grew, winters lengthened, trade dwindled. The system lost redundancy. One harsh winter no longer had backup plans. A failed summer harvest echoed for years. Firewood shortages meant colder homes. Colder homes meant illness. Illness weakened labor. Weak labor reduced preparation. The spiral tightened slowly, invisibly. The archaeological record tells a quiet story. Thinner bones show malnutrition. Abandoned farms appear intact, not destroyed, suggesting people left gradually, not violently. Fires go out. Roofs collapse. Knowledge fails not suddenly, but through rigidity. This is one of the most important lessons Vikings unintentionally left behind. Survival systems must evolve faster than the environment changes. In Scandinavia and Iceland, they did. In Greenland, eventually, they did not. Mistakes were powerful teachers. Vikings learned that relying too heavily on one food source was dangerous, that insulation without ventilation caused sickness, that social isolation increased mortality during winter, that ignoring subtle climate shifts, slightly longer winters, slightly weaker summers, was fatal over generations. And here is where modern humans often misunderstand cold survival. Today, we assume technology replaces knowledge. We build heated homes, wear synthetic insulation, rely on electricity. Yet power failures during winter storms still cause disaster. Modern homes freeze, pipes burst, people panic. Vikings rarely did because their systems assumed failure and planned for it. They planned for firewood shortages, for storms that trapped them indoors, for lost animals, for sickness, for darkness. Modern architecture often optimizes comfort, not resilience. Viking architecture optimized survival first, and comfort emerged naturally. Another misconception is that Vikings were fearless of cold. They were not. They respected it deeply. Fear sharpened preparation. Cold was not an enemy to conquer, but a force to negotiate with daily. This mindset shaped everything, from clothing layers to meal timing to sleeping arrangements. Perhaps the most profound Viking innovation was not architectural, but cultural. They aligned behavior with environment. They slept when darkness demanded. They worked when light allowed. They conserved energy instinctively. They accepted limits rather than fighting them blindly. Their failures, especially in Greenland, serve as warnings across centuries. Societies collapse not from sudden catastrophe alone, but from slow misalignment between culture and environment. When tradition hardens and adaptation stops, even the strongest systems unravel. Yet the success stories endure longer. Scandinavian longhouses, Icelandic turf farms still standing after 1,000 years, techniques rediscovered by modern passive house designers, lessons quietly embedded in sustainable architecture today. The Viking world reminds us that warmth is not just heat, it is knowledge, rhythm, cooperation, and humility before nature. And as winter nights stretch long again in the north, the old lessons still whisper through turf walls and collapsed hearths. Prepare early, adapt constantly, share knowledge freely, and never assume the environment will stay the same.
By the final centuries of the Viking Age, winter survival was no longer an experiment. It had become tradition, refined into instinct. Children grew up knowing where to sit in a longhouse to stay warm, how to read the sound of wind through turf walls, how to tell by the color of smoke whether a hearth was burning efficiently. These were not lessons taught formally, they were absorbed through living. Archaeology reveals this mastery in quiet details. In late Viking settlements, hearths are often found perfectly centered, not for symmetry, but for heat distribution. Floor layers showed deliberate insulation, wood chips, straw, compressed earth, arranged to trap warmth and moisture. Sleeping platforms grew slightly higher over generations, lifting bodies away from cold ground air. Even small changes mattered. Survival was cumulative. One of the most shocking discoveries came when archaeologists realized how clean many Viking homes were during winter. Contrary to the image of smoky, filthy huts, evidence shows controlled ventilation systems. Smoke-blackened beams appear in predictable patterns, suggesting airflow design. Small roof vents, adjustable openings, and door positioning allowed smoke to escape while retaining heat. Clean air meant fewer respiratory illnesses, an invisible advantage in long winters. Another revelation came from animal remains found inside longhouses. Bones, hoof prints, and compacted manure layers indicate animals were not just sheltered, they were integrated. Their body heat contributed to warmth, their presence stabilized indoor temperatures, their rhythms synchronized with human life. This was not desperation, it was design. As centuries passed, Viking winter knowledge outlived Viking identity itself. The raids faded, the sagas softened, Christianity spread, yet the houses remained. Farmers continued building turf walls, communities continued sharing winter labor. Knowledge slipped quietly into folklore and habit. Some techniques vanished. Iron tools replaced bone and stone. Trade altered diets. New political systems changed village cooperation. But the core ideas, thermal mass, insulation, shared heat, redundancy, persisted beneath the surface. In modern times, researchers began to notice something uncanny. Passive house designers studying energy-efficient buildings in Scandinavia kept rediscovering Viking principles. Thick walls, minimal openings, earth-sheltered structures, heat retention through mass rather than constant fuel consumption. Even modern geothermal homes mirror the Viking instinct to draw warmth from the ground itself. In Iceland, some turf houses built centuries ago remain warmer than nearby modern structures during power outages. When electricity fails, the old houses hold steady, the new ones grow cold quickly. The lesson is humbling. What truly survived was not architecture, but philosophy. Vikings never trusted a single system. They layered solutions. If fire failed, bodies clustered. If food ran low, sharing increased. If storms trapped them, routines adapted. Resilience lived in flexibility. The archaeological silence of abandoned Greenland farms still echoes. Empty hearths, intact tools, lives paused, not destroyed. They stand as reminders that knowledge must bend or break. Today, as climate uncertainty grows, Viking winter wisdom feels less like ancient history and more like instruction. Communities rediscover slow living, shared resources, seasonal rhythms. Architects rediscover earth-sheltered homes. Psychologists rediscover the importance of ritual and routine in darkness. The Viking longhouse was never meant to defeat winter forever. It was meant to carry humans safely through it, together. And perhaps that is why 1,000 years later, their quiet intelligence still warms the imagination, not because they were fearless warriors, but because they listened to wind, snow, darkness, and each other, and built lives that endured when warmth mattered most. By the final centuries of the Viking Age, winter survival was no longer an experiment. It had become tradition, refined into instinct. Children grew up knowing where to sit in a longhouse to stay warm, how to read the sound of wind through turf walls, how to tell by the color of smoke whether a hearth was burning efficiently. These were not lessons taught formally, they were absorbed through living. Archaeology reveals this mastery in quiet details. In late Viking settlements, hearths are often found perfectly centered, not for symmetry, but for heat distribution. Floor layers showed deliberate insulation, wood chips, straw, compressed earth, arranged to trap warmth and moisture. Sleeping platforms grew slightly higher over generations, lifting bodies away from cold ground air. Even small changes mattered. Survival was cumulative. One of the most shocking discoveries came when archaeologists realized how clean many Viking homes were during winter. Contrary to the image of smoky, filthy huts, evidence shows controlled ventilation systems. Smoke-blackened beams appear in predictable patterns, suggesting airflow design. Small roof vents, adjustable openings, and door positioning allowed smoke to escape while retaining heat. Clean air meant fewer respiratory illnesses, an invisible advantage in long winters. Another revelation came from animal remains found inside longhouses. Bones, hoof prints, and compacted manure layers indicate animals were not just sheltered, they were integrated. Their body heat contributed to warmth, their presence stabilized indoor temperatures, their rhythms synchronized with human life. This was not desperation, it was design. As centuries passed, Viking winter knowledge outlived Viking identity itself. The raids faded, the sagas softened, Christianity spread, yet the houses remained. Farmers continued building turf walls, communities continued sharing winter labor. Knowledge slipped quietly into folklore and habit. Some techniques vanished. Iron tools replaced bone and stone. Trade altered diets. New political systems changed village cooperation. But the core ideas, thermal mass, insulation, shared heat, redundancy, persisted beneath the surface. In modern times, researchers began to notice something uncanny. Passive house designers studying energy-efficient buildings in Scandinavia kept rediscovering Viking principles. Thick walls, minimal openings, earth-sheltered structures, heat retention through mass rather than constant fuel consumption. Even modern geothermal homes mirror the Viking instinct to draw warmth from the ground itself. In Iceland, some turf houses built centuries ago remain warmer than nearby modern structures during power outages. When electricity fails, the old houses hold steady, the new ones grow cold quickly. The lesson is humbling. What truly survived was not architecture, but philosophy. Vikings never trusted a single system. They layered solutions. If fire failed, bodies clustered. If food ran low, sharing increased. If storms trapped them, routines adapted. Resilience lived in flexibility. The archaeological silence of abandoned Greenland farms still echoes. Empty hearths, intact tools, lives paused, not destroyed. They stand as reminders that knowledge must bend or break. Today, as climate uncertainty grows, Viking winter wisdom feels less like ancient history and more like instruction. Communities rediscover slow living, shared resources, seasonal rhythms. Architects rediscover earth-sheltered homes. Psychologists rediscover the importance of ritual and routine in darkness. The Viking longhouse was never meant to defeat winter forever. It was meant to carry humans safely through it, together. And perhaps that is why 1,000 years later, their quiet intelligence still warms the imagination, not because they were fearless warriors, but because they listened to wind, snow, darkness, and each other, and built lives that endured when warmth mattered most.
Winter did not only attack the Viking body, it tested the mind in ways few modern people truly understand. Cold could be fought with fire and walls, but darkness seeped inward, slow and persistent. For weeks, sometimes months, the sun barely lifted itself above the horizon. Time blurred. Days and nights dissolved into a continuous gray.
In this world, sleep became both refuge and danger. Vikings learned early that uncontrolled sleep could kill. Too much sleep meant lethargy, weakness, loss of discipline. Too little sleep invited madness. So sleep was shaped, regulated, woven carefully into daily life. Long before science named circadian rhythms, Vikings obeyed them instinctively, or rather, they replaced the sun with culture. Inside the longhouse, light was ritualized. The hearth became the sun. Its glow marked time. When flames were high, work continued. When embers softened, voices lowered. Sleep did not arrive suddenly. It drifted in, gently, through stories, repetitive tasks, and quiet companionship. This gradual descent protected the mind from panic and isolation. People slept together, not out of poverty alone, but wisdom. Bodies shared heat, yes, but they also shared reassurance. The sound of breathing anchored consciousness. In total darkness, humans need proof they are not alone. Vikings understood this deeply. Solitary sleep in winter was rare and discouraged. Dreams mattered. Sagas mention dreams not as nonsense, but as messages shaped by long nights. Modern scholars once dismissed this as superstition. Now, psychologists recognize that extended darkness intensifies dream states. Vikings responded by talking about dreams openly. Morning conversations often began with recounting what the night had shown. This normalized fear, released anxiety, and kept imagination from turning inward destructively. Silence, too, was controlled. Absolute silence was unsettling, so someone always worked the fire, someone always mended tools, someone hummed low songs without words. These sounds created a living background, proof that life continued even when the outside world seemed dead. Children learned winter sleep early. They were allowed to nap, but not drift endlessly. Elders watched closely. A child sleeping too long was gently woken, given food, asked to help with simple tasks. This preserved strength and routine. Winter demanded energy conservation, not hibernation. The longhouse itself guided sleep. Sleeping platforms were raised, insulated, positioned away from drafts. The warmest spots were reserved for the youngest and weakest. Elders often slept closer to walls, accepting discomfort as responsibility. This unspoken hierarchy was another survival mechanism. Nightmares were expected. Fear of storms, wolves, starvation, spirits, these lived in the dark. Vikings did not deny fear. They named it, wrapped it in stories, turned it into something communal. A fear spoken aloud lost its sharpest edge. Storytelling reached its peak in winter nights. Sagas stretched long, sometimes across multiple evenings. The repetition was intentional. Familiar stories calmed the mind. Predictability soothed anxiety. Knowing how a story ended was more comforting than surprise. Sleep came easier when the mind rested in known patterns. Alcohol, often misunderstood, was used carefully. Light ale warmed the body and relaxed muscles, but excess was discouraged in deep winter. Drunkenness increased accidents, disrupted sleep, and wasted calories. Again, discipline disguised as culture. The greatest danger of Arctic winter was not cold, but disorientation, losing track of time, purpose, and self. Viking sleep culture prevented this. Every day had structure, even when days could not be seen. Wake, work, eat, story, rest. Over and over. Rhythm became survival. Some archaeologists believe this is why Viking longhouses feel strangely calming even in ruins. The proportions, the enclosure, the earth-toned darkness, everything reduces sensory overload. Modern visitors often report feeling quiet, grounded, almost sleepy inside reconstructed longhouses. The architecture still whispers its original purpose.
When spring finally returned, sleep changed again. Longer waking hours, less clustering, more individual movement. The system loosened naturally, without conflict, because it was never rigid. Winter discipline gave way to summer freedom. This balance, tight structure in darkness, flexibility in light, was one of the Vikings' greatest unspoken achievements. Many societies failed not because of cold, but because they resisted changing rhythms. Vikings flowed with them. And so, when we speak of Viking homes never freezing, we must understand the walls stayed warm because the people inside stayed balanced. Heat came from fire, turf, animals, but endurance came from sleep, rhythm, and shared nights. In the end, Viking survival was not loud or heroic, it was quiet. It sounded like breathing in the dark, like embers shifting softly, like a familiar story told one more time while snow pressed gently against the walls.